Yo, it's CJ. In this video, we're going through all of the class changes that Blizzard is making to the Mists of Pandaria beta. These changes completely change everything that you've seen on your PvE tier list. And again, with that said, keep in mind that all of the changes covered in this video are PvE changes unless specified otherwise. Another thing to note is that Blizzard has been tweaking things a lot every couple of days, and so these changes may not even be what you see on the final iteration of Mists of Pandaria when it comes to launch on July 21st. And towards the end of the video, I'm going to tell you what happens to all of your Honor, Justice, Valor, and Conquest points as we transition from Cataclysm into Mists of Pandaria. Let's jump in! So the first class we're going to talk about is Death Knights, and the first spec, Blood. So the very first game change on June 17th for Blood DK, where Outbreak's cooldown was actually reduced from 60 seconds down to 30. Blood DKs are really strong, but this change was just more so to make their gameplay a little bit smoother in dungeons. The rest of the Blood changes came on June 24th. All of your pets, including Army of the Dead, no longer gain the attack power benefit from Vengeance. The damage reduction from Blood Presence was raised from 10 to 12%. Dancing Rune Weapons damage was actually reduced by 50%, which will no longer be the case. And Dancing Rune Weapons Rune Strike was actually using the wrong rank. And Rune Strike will no longer have an erroneous 10% attack power ratio. Moving on to Frost DK. The AoE effect of Howling Blast damage was actually increased from 50% up to 65%. Soul Reaper and Obliterate now also scale with your Mastery, which is huge. But it seems like those changes were a little bit too strong for Frost two-hander, and so the Mastery for Frost two-hander has actually been reduced by about 20%. Moving on to Druid. First up, Balance. Moonkin's Form flat increase to Arcane and Nature damage was increased from 10 to 20%. Shooting Stars will no longer split its chance to proc across multiple targets. And then on June 17th, Force of Nature had its damage increased by 9.1%. Moving on to Feral, on June 12th, Ferals once again learned Nature Swiftness, but only outside of arenas and battlegrounds. And on June 24th, the duration of Predatory Swiftness was raised to 12 seconds, up from 8. Moving on to Guardian, on June 12th, Maul's Rage cost was actually reduced from 30 to 20. On June 17th, Bear Form got a flat damage increase by 5%. On June 24th, they got a buff to Dream of Cenarius, slightly increasing their chance to proc a Mangle Crit. The cooldown for Heart of the Wild was also decreased to 3 minutes from 6. And when Bear Hug is cast on an enemy that's permanently immune to stuns, Bear Hug actually lowers their damage by 10% instead. And the duration of this is not increased by the PvP gloves. Moving over to Resto Druid, we have one simple change on June 12th, which is Naturalist's increase to healing was moved up to 15% from 10. Moving over to Hunter with the one and only survival change. On June 17th, Explosive Shot's damage was lowered by 7%. And over to Marksmanship Hunter that got a lot of buffs. On June 20th, both Steady Shot and Aim Shot were increased by 10% damage. Along with that, Barrage and Chimera Shot damage was also increased by 15%. Jumping over to Mage and starting with Fire. On June 12th, Combustion got a big buff, taking in more of the damage from Ignite. On June 20th, Pyroblast damage was increased by 12%. And Critical Mass's increase to critical strike rating was increased to a 1.5x from a 1.3x. On June 24th, Fire Mages got a change to Inferno Blast, making the way that it spreads Ignite a little bit more intuitive, which spreads full duration Ignites instead of allowing players to compress Ignites into bigger ticks. Blizzard's attempting to make Fire Mage gameplay a lot more interesting with these changes. And over to some raw damage increases for Arcane Mage. On June 20th, Arcane Barrage was increased by 19%. Arcane Blast damage was increased by 29%, and Arcane Blast mana cost was lowered by 10%. On June 24th, they received further buffs. Arcane Missiles damage was increased by 28%, and Arcane Blast damage was increased by an extra 8% for a total of 37%. Arcane is going to bring some serious heat to the start of this expansion. Moving over to Monk and starting with Mistweaver. Teaching of the Monastery's Crackling Jade Lightning was decreased to 25% damage. Manatee's mana returned per stack was increased from 4% to 5%. Surging Mist mana cost was also lowered by 13%. And Rushing Jade Wind will now be cancelled when Mistweavers enter the stance of the Wise Serpent. Jab cost was lowered by 25% mana. Enveloping Mist healing was increased by 48%. Eminence healing was raised by 68%. Revival's healing was raised by 43%. And Glyph of Targeted Expulsion changes Uplift to cost no chi, but instead cost 10% of base mana. All of that happened on June 12th, and on June 17th, they started to roll back some. Revival healing was decreased by 15%, taking it to a 22% increase overall. And on June 24th, when Vital Mist is at 5 stacks and you cast a Surging Mist, it will not reset your auto attack. That was a lot, but jumping over to Windwalker. Now, Blizzard has tweaked the Mastery for Windwalker monks, making it a little less painful when it doesn't proc. Prior, Mastery actually used to give you a chance to get an extra stack of Tiger's Eye Brew But now going forward, it's just going to give you a straight up damage increase based on what your mastery is. Tiger's Eye Brew will start with a 3.5% base damage increase per stack, plus 1.6% from base mastery, with your ability to increase it by 0.2 per mastery. Tiger's Eye Brew now gains a charge after spending 3 chi, down from 4. And the tier 15 Windwalker Monk 4-set bonus has been reverted to you have a 10% chance to gain an additional stack of Tiger Eye Brew every time you gain a charge of Tiger Eye Brew while not inside an arena or battleground. All of those changes came on June 12th, and jumping over to Brewmaster with one quick change on June 20th, Blackout Kick damage was increased by 25%. Jumping over to Pally and starting with Holy cow, there's a lot of changes. Eternal's Flame Periodic Healing has been lowered by 28%. Eternal Flame's Periodic Healing can also activate Illuminated Healing. Illuminated Healing's base value has been increased to 12% from 10. And on June 13th, Seal of Insight was changed to restore 4% base mana to the Paladin on every melee attack. Additionally, Devotion Aura now decreases damage taken from all sources by 20% instead of just being magical effects only for Holy Paladins. On June 17th, some bug fixes were made for Seal of Insight, so it correctly restored the normal amount of mana, and they actually increased it from 4% to 6% base mana per swing. To help out Holy Paladins with their melee ability, they also decreased the mana cost for Crusader Strike by 20%. The final 2 changes for Holy Paladin came on June 20th. Holy Insight now increases your chance to hit with Crusader Strike by 7.5%, and casting Crusader Strike throughout an encounter is going to make the encounter believe that the Holy Paladin is now a melee person. If the Paladin does not cast Crusader Strike for a certain period of time, the raid will then consider them a ranged person once again. This is going to change how certain mechanics affect your raid. Moving over to Protection Paladin for 2 changes that happened on June 12th. The damage reduction from Sanctuary was increased to 20%, and the shielding on Sacred Shield was increased by 43%. And jumping over to Ret Paladin, on June 12th, Divine Storm, Crusader Strike, Judgment, Hammer of Righteous, Hammer of Wrath, and Exorcism all had their damage increased by 10%. Additionally, your Holy Power Spender Templar's Verdict had its damage increased by 20%. And jumping over to Priest with some quick general changes before we get into the classes. Divine Star and Halo now obey the AoE cap of 20 targets for damage and 6 targets for healing before they start splitting that total amount damaged or healed. And the maximum times that Cascade can bounce was decreased to 3 from 4. Moving over to Discipline on June 12th, Divine Aegis was lowered to 80% of the heal's value instead of 100%. And the tier 14 set bonus for Penance cooldown was lowered to 1 second from 3. This actually brings Penance to an 8-second cooldown, which aligns with how it was in the original 5.0 patch. Atonement healing from damage was actually lowered to 70% from 90%. Divine Star for Discipline Priests have been lowered by 25% effectiveness. And Divine Aegis's healing conversion was increased by 12.5% effectiveness, taking it to 90% from about 80. And Spirit Shell's active duration was increased by 50% up to 15 seconds from 10. Overall, tough changes for Disc Priest, you did get nerfed. And jumping over to Holy Priest changes on June 13th. Holy Serenity healing was increased by 40%. Holy Word Sanctuary healing was increased by 60%. And Holy Word Sanctuary had its mana cost reduced by 33%. And Holy Priest Mastery will now do its healing every 1 second instead of 3 seconds, which is pretty big. Divine Hymn will now also heal up to 50 raid members regardless of the raid size. This is to essentially account for all of the pets that were in raid taking up spots for this heal. And with that said, the cap was increased, which means their healing output was massively increased, so the overall healing output was actually decreased by 35%. Chakra Sanctuary's increase to AoE healing was increased to 35%, up from 25%, and Serenity's increase to single target healing was increased to 35%, also up from 25%. And Chakra's cooldown was decreased to 10 seconds, down from 30, giving you a lot more flexibility. Moving over to some Shadow Priest changes on June 12th. Shadow Form's damage increase was raised from 25% to 30%. And on June 17th, they increased Shadow Word Pain's damage by 18%. Moving over to Rogue. General changes first. Sinister Strike's energy cost was reduced from 50 to 40 on June 12th. And with that, they also decreased Sinister Strike's weapon damage to 192%, down from 240. Moving over to Assassination spec, the damage increase from Assassination's Resolve was increased to 25%, up from 20. And moving over to combat, Blizzard actually added a counter to Bandit's Guile that will allow you to track your Sinister Strikes and Revealing Strikes a lot more effectively. Jumping over to Shaman. Quick general changes. Healing Rain output was lowered by 25%. Also, the maximum duration through conductivity was lowered to 30 seconds from 40 seconds. Ancestral Guidance's healing and damage conversion was also lowered to 20%. Moving over to Elemental, Lightning Bolt's damage was increased by 10%. Jumping over to Enhance, Stormstrike's weapon damage was raised to 450%. And jumping over to Resto Shaman, Chain Heal now reduces the amount of healing per target it bounces to by 20% per bounce. Previously it was 0. And Riptide's mana cost was increased by 15%. And jumping over to some Warlock changes that happened on June 12th. Malefic Grasp damage was raised by 50%. The damage of Malefic Grasp also causes your other dots to deal 50%, up from 30%. Drain Soul's damage was also increased by 50%. And the damage that Drain Soul causes your other dots to do, it was increased to 100%, up from 60%. On June 17th, Affliction comes in with even more buffs. Corruption's damage over time was increased by 33%. Agony's damage over time was increased by 18%. And Haunt's damage to your damage over time effects increased to 40%, up from 35%. That Haunt change wasn't very long-lived. On June 24th, they actually reverted it back down to 35%. And Curse of Agony's damage was also brought back down a little bit lower, coming up to a 5% increase overall. Jumping over to Demonology. Wild Imp damage was increased by 43%. The number of imps summoned by your Glyph of Imp Swarm was also increased to 5, up from 4. Hellfire and Immolation Aura's damage was increased by 25%, and Chaos Wave's damage was increased by 50%. On June 17th, they got an additional buff, increasing the damage of Doom by 33%. On June 12th, a Warlock Glyph got a small change. Glyph of Eternal Resolve now increases the duration of damage over time spells associated with the old Glyph of Everlasting Affliction by 50%, but decreases the damage by 20%. And moving over to our last class of the video, Warrior. Starting off on June 12th with changes that came to Fury. Crazed Berserker's auto attack damage was increased to 15%, up from 10%. Crazed Berserker's offhand damage was increased to 30%, up from 25%. And the final change for Fury is that the duration of Berserker Rage and Enrage have been increased by 33%. Moving over to Protection Warrior for one change on June 17th. Shield Barrier's attack power modifier was increased to 2.0, up from 1.8. And on to just some general changes for Warrior. On June 12th, we got a bug fix. Previously, taking damage in Berserker stance that was absorbed, where your health part didn't move down, wouldn't actually grant you Rage. Now, you correctly gain Rage even through absorbs. And on June 24th, Shattering Blow got a change to be an instant cast that does not reset your weapon swing timer. So, on July 1st, when the pre-patch launches, you'll no longer be able to earn any Valor or Conquest until the actual official launch. Your existing Valor and Conquest points are going to be converted into Justice and Honor points. That said, your Justice and Honor points are going to have a cap of 4,000, so anything that exceeds the 4,000 cap is going to be converted into gold. And that conversion rate is going to be 47 silver per Justice point and 35 silver per Honor point. That means you're only going to get 587.5 gold per 1,250 Conquest points. So make sure that you spend your extra Valor on BOEs and sell them early instead of losing money now by letting it get converted. Existing Conquest and Valor vendors are going to start selling their gear for Justice and Honor, and that's going to make it really easy to gear up over these next couple of weeks. Then, once Mists of Pandaria launches officially on July 21st, you're going to immediately start being able to gain Valor. You'll have the same weekly cap as Cataclysm at 1,600 per week, and if you miss a week, don't worry about it, because that's actually going to start rolling forward, and so in the second week, you'll be able to get 3,200. Daily quests, heroics, scenarios, and raids will all reward Valor. And finally, the PvP season actually starts just 1 week after launch on July 28th. At that point, you're going to start being able to gain your Conquest up to a max of 4,000 per week. And again, that's also going to roll forward, just like the Valor Point system too. This means that if you make an alt middle of the season, or come to the game in the middle of the season, you'll still be able to catch up on all of the gear that everyone else has. And with that being said, I hope that you found this video informative, and if you did, please consider giving it a like, leaving a comment down below, and checking out my channel and giving me a subscription as well. The support of my channel goes a long way, and I'm a new creator, so I really appreciate all the support I can get. Thank you so much, and have a great day. Peace!
General, you and your best veterans will pave our way, storm the shore, and paint this new continent red!